Welcome to Short and to the Point, a podcast from the Comeback in Awful Announcing. Here's your host, Jessica Kleinschmidt.
Hi, y'all. Welcome back to another episode of Short and to the Point on Awful Announcing and the Comeback. Jessica Kleinschmidt here once again. We're still continuing with the baseball guests because it's the postseason. It's not the off season, folks. It's the postseason. I hope you're following everything that's going on. It's been a pretty intense series across the board, so I'm glad that we're continuing with a baseball guest. This time around, Foul Territory's own Scott Braun joins me. I've been a fan of his work for years. I'm so lucky that he stopped by because he used to work for MLB Network, and that's when I started looking at his work, and I take notes when he is on air. But now he's transitioned to this new role with Foul Territory, and it's something that him and I spoke about before on his podcast, on his show on Foul Territory. The difference your voice gets when you're on a specific platform. When you're with the network, you have to say a certain thing. I, of course, work with the Oakland A's, and that's a different verbiage that I have to use compared to what I can do here on the Awful Announcing and the Comeback sites. But it's important to show off the balance. So he definitely talked about how he gets to be himself more and show off who he truly is with this new platform. And he has the best guests in the world. Every baseball guest you can imagine has come across the Foul Territory platform. So it's good to see that baseball players are getting a voice, a true, authentic, real voice. And that's something that we discussed. So I picked his brain about that and so much more. So here's my chat with Scott Braun. Well, Scott is here. Hi, how are you, my friend? It's good to see you.
Jessica, it's great to see you, and happy postseason.
Thank you. I know it's kind of crazy how it all shaped out. And there's a lot to talk about. When I was prepping for this, it was like topic. So I'm really excited to get started. And, you know, we're just going to get started with Foul Territory. Obviously, you're sporting it on your shirt. And this is a new platform. Beautifully done, sir. This is a new platform for baseball media. So how did this come about?
So for me, in our sport, I felt like we were lacking destinations like this for players to be able to express their opinions freely, and also just for one of our phrases that we use, baseball the way it should be covered. Our game has daily news, drama. There's games every day, basically, during the regular season. And I often felt like what makes baseball so entertaining and appealing, especially maybe for a more casual fan that doesn't need a swing breakdown every time something's talked about, that there was a space for them, and I just didn't feel like those topics were being covered enough. Now, bringing it to a larger scale in terms of conversations within the game, I mean, I've been working in baseball for well over a decade now in my adult professional career life, and being around players, I felt like it was just crowdsourcing what they were talking about. Anyone know any good podcasts? Hey, some story just broke. Where can we actually hear more about it? Where can we talk about it? Besides many great spots to actually read about it. I didn't feel like there were many great destinations, if any, to actually be able to hear about it and watch it. So that's what stood out to me. And I also think, say, in football and basketball, they have done a fantastic job of cultural relevance pretty much year round. I feel like baseball has the same storylines, and they're just not being emphasized as much. So add all of that up, and Foul Territory was born. And also, you're bringing on former players, mostly fresh out of the game, with opinions, with contacts in the industry that we can bring on, for the most part, 3 guests per day to talk about the great game.
And that's been kind of cool, too. I feel like you guys are not short of guests. And when it comes to that, you know, you have to market these players. And I feel like it's the same song and dance when it comes to baseball. It's such a difficult thing for us to do, to promote the players who play this game. How do you promote the players? Because I feel like we're lacking in that department. I think we will be for quite a bit.
I agree. I think we have so much work to do to promote the talent and the personalities. I mean, you know, you've been around ballparks and clubhouses for years, and you're always laughing. You're always learning something. There's always a juicy, interesting story about what really goes down on a certain situation, even on some of the most simple things that, you know, to a player would feel like no big deal. Like, hey, tell me how you work with the traveling secretary and playoff shares and all of these cool stories and inside access that often just doesn't get told, not to mention multiple times per week where a story blows up and gets covered and you want to hear a player perspective on it. Think about it. After a game, which is the time when players are interviewed the most, there's a big topic in the sport, like Orlando Arcia throwing out his comments and Bryce Harper having fun with them and taking it into the game, and then the media component of it. If that happened during the season and you were covering the Cubs or the Giants or the A's, whatever, right? You wouldn't go in the clubhouse necessarily and start having a 20-minute combo with a player about that right after they lost a walk-off game, right? It might just not be the time. There's some other times to mix it in, but for us, this is the time during the middle of the day for us to have a live show, to be able to bring on players. We've had over 200 player guest appearances this year, and actually talk to them about themselves, a little bit about what's going on in the field, of course, a lot about what's going on in their life, but then also get their opinions, because I just think that's interesting too. Every current player can be an analyst talking about what's going on in the game. So I felt like that was lacking. And if we can show off that most of these players are funny or opinionated and can be experts on these topics, then it's going to make the game more interesting.
And speaking of opinions, I feel like over time the players have opened up a lot more. And I think social media has been hit or miss, and it either helps or hinders them in that regard. How have you watched the transition over the years? And I'm not just talking about from the platform MLB Network, but just seeing how the players have opened up a little bit more toward the media or a different type of platform. Have you noticed those changes?
Of course. So you have your own platform, but I think where we can come in is a player can post, a player can speak into their phone, but some of it's just awkward and can almost feel like self-promoting, and it still comes out better if someone else is asking the question, even if you have a point that you want to make. So, I mean, the easy example that gets coverage all the time on AA and everywhere else, right? It's like the McAfee-Rogers relationship and how he can speak to him. Like if Aaron had his own show and was just speaking for 30 minutes straight, would it come out the same way? I feel like it's better if you're having a conversation. I'm also just big on listening to people talk and communicate. That's like how life works. So I feel like there's a big topic and there's a player who wants to comment on it. If he just does this all the time and says, hey, here's my opinion on this, a lot of people are going to be like, dude, you're full of yourself. And there might be follow-up questions that should be asked. So I feel like this is the way to do it. I mean, of course, social media is super helpful for players to be able to throw their opinion out there very quickly on a topic. I feel like this is just the extension of that. It's like, oh, so-and-so put out a really cool tweet response to something going on in our world right now. Like Jose Barrios getting removed after a few innings from a game. Almost every player has an opinion on that. Yeah. And actually some of them didn't have just the all out, I can't believe they did this, what a crime. And you want to hear from them too. Like we just had a conversation with Tyler Glasnow about it, and he said, I understand both sides. I mean, he's a pitcher on the Rays. They're going to be analytical and go into the fight with a decision on strategy, and they are not going to waver from that. And that's their thing. So it's cool to hear that side of it. And then other players come on and they're like, what the hell was that? Or, you know, we're cursing somewhat frequently on our show, and players like to talk that way. And they're like, WTF. So it's good to hear opinions and comments like that, and it makes people more relatable, because that's what you would talk about. Like if you had a dinner with a player after a game, those are the conversations that you would hear. And the one standout for me, Jess, is if you hear it sometimes from a former player talking to a current player, right? Guys that basically played with each other on the same team or battled against each other, you're just going to get different answers sometimes. Yes. So I try and get out of the way as often as I can so that Pierzynski, Kratz, Kipnis, Kane, Todd Frazier, Adam Jones, whatever, can ask those questions. As long as those hosts on Foul Territory are like totally open book and unfiltered, then the answers are going to be great. And we're just taking a playbook from what I think many shows are doing in football and basketball.
Yeah, and it's kind of cool that you kind of step back. You are technically one of the main hosts, but you also know, you don't have the same resume as some of those guys. Was that easy for you to kind of take a step back and let AJ do their thing with the guest?
I love it. I love it. This is not about me.
Yeah.
I'm there to be the point guard, to get us through topics, to bring on guests, to provide a fan / media follow-up or perspective where I can, which can be important. But for the most part, the best part of the interviews are when the players are asking the questions. So you'll see, I mean, if you watch or listen to the show consistently, because also a lot of people will absorb the show in YouTube breakout clips or on certain social media platforms, or we break it up into certain formats on the podcast pages, then you might miss that. Like there could be a time period where for 15 plus minutes, I disappear. I'm there, I'm sitting there, I'm on Slack talking to our production staff, our social team, doing all kinds of stuff behind the scenes because I'm doing even more behind the scenes versus what I'm doing on the show. And just let those guys go. Often the questions, I might have the same questions. We might chat and be like, hey, you want to ask them about the Brio situation? Because it'd be cooler coming from a catcher who just got out of the bigs than from me. So I have no problem. I mean, you can ask people that worked with me at MLB or here too. It's not about me. I can definitely get on a roll and talk someone's ear off for a billion hours. But with a show like this, I can also disappear and smile even more so than I would if I was the one talking.
Definitely. And you mentioned, because I started following your work during MLB Network days. And the one thing that you and I talked about, first of all, thank you for allowing me to be a guest on Foul Territory previously. That
Thank
was
you.
Fun. Of course.
Come back.
Of course. One thing that you and I talked about was the difference you're able to, express yourself compared to MLB Network versus Foul Territory. What were some of those biggest differences that you've noticed?
Biggest news topics in the sport have to be looked at differently if you work for a league. I don't think I am breaking any news for baseball. Football has a network, basketball, hockey, etc. That if you watch a league-owned content or team-owned content the same way, right? If you're the broadcaster for a team and a story goes down, this has been a thing for decades now at this point. It's going to be communicated differently. There is public relations behind it. There are sensitive executives, owners, players, whatever it is that are thought of when they're talking about news and breaking things down. So obviously I was working for a league. Now our group is independent. We have partners for distribution. We have sponsors, all of that, but there is nothing off bounds in terms of what we're talking about within sports. We are not a political show. There's a billion of those. We're not a dating show, but anything in sports, and that includes a player getting in trouble, an owner saying something dumb. We'll cover it all and realize that often we're trying to go after the topics that everyone's talking about. If you work for a team or a league, there are many topics that you either A, can't touch at all, or B, are going to breeze through and read a line on a teleprompter and move on. So that happens all of the time, right? And I mean, an easy example is anything that is related to an owner. I'll give you a really current example. I think this story is super undercovered at the moment because it just happened and it's the postseason. I was super excited, and I know Kimming and have had probably 5 to 10 conversations with her, most of those on the air on interviews, and think that she's brilliant, well-respected, have known about her for years. She's been in the game for a long time. Overqualified to be a general manager.
Yeah.
Anyone would say that. Took too long for her to get a job, gets a job, does an exceptional job of getting a team that barely spends any money, that's always in a financial bind in terms of what they give their executive staff, takes them to the postseason pretty quickly after joining, and then gets told after the season, according to what I'm reading, right, from multiple very, very trustworthy reporters, that someone was going to be hired above her and that she would only be on a 1-year contract at the moment. That doesn't happen in the game. So that has to be looked at. Awful optics for the sport. And we don't hold back talking about that topic within our own show, within other players, right? If we talk to other players, we'll probably grab some Marlins in the offseason that will be pretty vocal and critical about a story like that. Like, I'm sorry, what happened? What was wrong here? We don't like making the playoffs. I don't know everything going on behind the scenes at all times, but I'm telling you, we made this part clear. Baseball, for example, as a sport, whether it's an owner, PR, commissioner, somebody needs to come out because we praise the hell out of that story. Someone needs to come out and say, hey, here's what happened. And here's why it's not as bad as it looks, that the first female general manager gets hired a few years ago and does an awesome job and then essentially gets demoted right after making the postseason. That to me is mind-boggling.
Mm-hmm.
What I just said for the last 30 seconds probably would get a talking to if I said it on the Marlins broadcast, if I said it on MLB, if I said it on maybe even other spots that are affiliated with other leagues or organizations. So you have to be able to talk about those topics freely.
And I love that. When did you notice that in your MLB career that you had to hold back on certain aspects?
I think right away. I mean, I even knew when I was looking into jobs in college. Like, I'll use an example. No one said anything to me, but one of my internships was with the Miami Heat when I was in college, and then they ended up doing a kids day where they would have, I mean, kid, but you're in college. They would have, young adults go on the broadcast. I got to do like a quarter or a half. Cool. You're not going to go on there and be like, the GM stinks. And also, that's not the right spot or time for it. But right away. I actually used to. I speak all the time to aspiring broadcasters, journalists, people that want to be in the industry. And I travel a ton. I'm always on the road. Even still now with this job, we've had a lot of remote shows with Foul Territory. So I like to talk to people. And I've changed how I give this advice out. But I always would say, hey, if you want to work for a team or a league, you better be careful what you're saying and what you're putting out on social media, right? So if you're a super fan of a team, and let's say you want to work for the marketing department of that team, they might scrub through your tweets or your Instagram and be like, hey, you were saying that our owner is a joke, or that you hate our logo or something like that. And they might not hire you because of that. Same thing would occur if you wanted to work for a freaking tech company or an energy company or something like that. This, to me, it wasn't surprising. I think it gets a little bit more nuanced when you're talking for hours every day. So you just have to, for the most part, communicate with your producer on how a story is handled. So that's what would happen, right? Like, so when I'm hosting, MLB Tonight or MLB Now or one of those shows that I used to host in the past for MLB, you're having a conversation with your producer. Hey, this news just came out. How are we handling it? One of the most complicated ones was A-Rod. If you go back in the day, I mean, we had a point where, like, I was there for over a decade. A-Rod's like suing everybody, and you're like, how are we covering this story? It's crazy because it's not even like it was just against the league. It was against his own players union. It was a freaking wild story if you look back to what was going on at the time. So for me, those are just conversations like, how are we doing this? And sure, sometimes like someone might talk to you afterward. I mean, I had a situation where I called out the Angels years ago, and then one of their broadcasters was kind of going after me on Twitter. This is a long time ago, saying like, I'm not watching the games. And I was like, actually, I have insomnia. I watch the late night games more than I watch the early games. I'm watching plenty. All I said was I was on Sirius at the time on MLB Network Radio, because I did shows on there for several years. And I said, I feel like they're wasting Mike Trout's prime years away. That aged really well. I was pissed off. I was like, this is the best player. Like, he needs more support. Also, I knew a lot and still do a lot going on behind the scenes, where Artie Moreno is cheap as hell. He'll buy a player, a position player, and didn't like pitching for a while. The spring training situation there and some of the tools that they give their pitchers and hitters, just an absolute joke. Knew about it, knew that it was going to be a problem for a while. You can't be a helicopter owner. I didn't go that hard. I wouldn't. But just saying that one line, I had a team employee going after me, and I went back and then was told by the former president that I was working for at the time to just chill about it. So I did.
And it's so interesting though, because I feel like it's almost therapeutic in a way. Did you notice that, like, personally, were you able to feel better knowing that you didn't have to say, hey, producers, how are we handling this? You got to be in charge of the content you get to talk about. And you also get to talk about what you want to talk about for the way that Scott is.
I'm having by far the most fun of my life, period.
Good.
In my career. I mean that wholeheartedly, in terms of the people I get to work with, the things that I get to say, the conversations that I get to be a part of. Feel like I'm a better version of myself now than I ever was. I feel like I can express myself the way that I want to. I also, for the most part, hate wearing suits, and I get to wear t-shirts every day. That doesn't hurt either. But you know, you have like a concrete schedule. Everything about my life has significantly improved. So yes, it feels liberating to just be able to talk like I would normally talk. And actually, I will tell you this, I know there were a few friends that I worked with that were like, "Is this how you really are?" And I was like, "Yeah, duh." I was like, "Is this how I am when we go to dinner, when we're on the road for the postseason?" They're like, "Yeah." So I was like, "Yeah." So now I'm just talking like that all the time.
I thought you woke up and put a suit on and showered in a suit. That's who I thought you were for the longest time. So I think it's really cool to see you just be you. And it's so weird because I mean, just dealing with what I've dealt with in the past, like if you're struggling with like a job, we're so lucky to do what we do. Don't get us wrong. But at the same time, it's like, well, why are you complaining? You get to talk about baseball and write about baseball for a living. It's like, well, there's certain things that we do have to be careful of. And that's no different than foul territory also. You still have to be careful of the certain things that you say. So that's kind of cool. What about how the players have reacted compared to your time at MLB Network or doing anything with a team compared to foul territory? Have you noticed they're able to express themselves a little bit more?
Yeah, I think there's an excitement level for them
Yeah.
to hop on the show. And I feel like my conversations are different. I felt like sometimes if I was talking to a player, they might be a little more guarded. And I'm like, "Oh, cool. Yeah, I'm listening to the show." I feel like there's a lot of people in the industry that are consuming the content, which is cool because I mean, there's even been times where I don't remember where I was, but a player was like, "Oh yeah, aren't you guys doing a watch party for that?" And I was like, "Oh, you know about that?
You
Okay."
know about the watch
Yeah, I'm
party.
following. I was like, "Oh, cool. Okay." So I feel like the players love it because I don't think there are a lot of platforms that are covering the game this extensively and this
Mhm.
openly, right?
Yeah.
There are, and I don't want to discount this, like, there are people that are putting together really awesome content in baseball, right? On YouTube and with their own pods and all of that. But I would say, I mean, we're pumping out hours of content and shows every day and then doing it in a somewhat unique format. And there's multiple players joining those shows every day. That's different. It's new. So I think it's become a new destination for people within the industry to be able to listen to the game and get caught up on like the big, major, relevant stories. That's the one other difference too, is we still talk about stats. And we, right now, especially during the postseason, I mean, some of the breakdowns of the games in the LCSA right now from Pierzynski and Kratz and Todd Frazier and some of these guys we're working with. Ken Rosenthal is on the road, but also is a big part of this group. They're awesome. It's great. But we don't just do that. You know, like this Kimming story pops up, like we're covering it. We're not just saying it for 5 seconds and then moving on to breaking down how so-and-so's pinky is like a little bit more like this now, and that's why he got the base hit the other day. You know, that's fine sometimes, but for me, I wasn't a player and I'm a huge fan and I'm consuming the content even before I got into this business a lot, but I can only do so much of that, like the very intense, here's exactly why this person's doing this, because sometimes also it's wrong. If you saw like the Pete Alonso poop homer story, sometimes, you know, real life just happens and dude hit a first pitch slider.
Who's better to talk about that than the guys on your squad? Yeah.
Came up very organically too, because it was from Eugenio Suarez of the Mariners. I don't remember the exact story, but I think he was in the bathroom and then got quickly called up to be a pinch hitter or whatever, right? And we just brought it up as one of the news stories on our show. And then of course it lights up our player hosts. So Todd Frazier's like, "Oh dude, I got a story like that," right? And he starts telling it as Pete Alonso is being checked in by our production team and sound check to come on the show as a guest. And he hears it, and immediately that turns into him going, "I got a story like that too, like a week ago." And for some reason too, I mean, dude hits, 50 homers a year. Eric Kratz on the show that day, and he's like, he knew the exact homer that he was even talking about. He's like, "Oh, the one in Cincinnati off Hunter Green, the first pitch slider," and it was just gold. And for me, I smiled because we can break down the hell out of strategy and a guy having a good approach, but also sometimes dude just mistimed his pregame coffee, and it's relatable. I think those kind of stories for baseball, and obviously you had to, you use, I don't know if I can curse on here, but you use, a word that like lights a player up, shit, right? Like they just think it's funny, and it's like, "Oh, I had to go too," whatever, right? So I remember seeing the story get picked up by other publications and other, social media aggregator accounts. And the comments were awesome. The
Yeah.
comments were like, hey, I'm not a baseball fan and I live in somewhere in Europe, but this dude's my new favorite, like
Yeah.
he is my freaking sports hero because he just told it like it is. And he's just like the rest of us. That is cool and good for the game. And there's tons of those stories in baseball that are not out there that should be.
I agree. And it's kind of cool to see all the different elements come together because you still created not just a great story and like dudes being bros, like talking about it. There's still good content there. There's still good production work without even trying too hard. And then you create it, people pick it up, aggregation, and that's always a bonus. But on that, how do you find the balance? Because for me personally, you want to be informative and you want to be educational. You want to make sure that they leave learning something, but also having a good time. So do you think it's easier to bring in the entertainment factor or easier to bring in the informative factor?
I would say easier to bring in the informative factor because with our player group, I'm saying, right? With like the 10 hosts that are part of Foul Territory right now, they played the game for many years. So they're used to being able to talk about what just happened with a play. I think it's harder sometimes to get those stories out because, like, going back to that Pete Alonso story, how do we know that? Unless you're super tight with him, or I don't even know if many of the teammates knew about that at the time. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But I think one of the ways to get those stories out, the entertainment component, is just to be there every day. So that's what we're doing. We're doing live shows 5 days a week, year round. After the season, we'll be on every day, year round, maybe a week off for Christmas for the whole group, Christmas week to New Year's. But doing that means that you are more likely to catch those stories. You also are there for when something breaks. So we will be still, doing hours of baseball talk show content specific, no other sport, year round. And I think the more of that occurs, right, the better chance you're going to catch gold. And the one balance though, Jess, is that we're not, when we tell a player, hey, you want to hop on the show, or they say, hey, can I come on the show? We are not taking up in my mind, too much of their time. We tried to crowdsource when is the best time to do a show like this.
Yeah.
Not even data wise, right? Because most people are going to consume it kind of on demand afterward anyway, right? When is the best time if we want to get as many players on as possible during the season? And so we found that window, 1 to 3 Eastern seemed to be the best window when we talked to 50 players about it. When's the best time? Same thing with like how much time is a good sweet spot. And the number for us was generally in the 20-minute range, right? Most of the conversations we're having with players are like 15 to 25. It might go a little longer because they're just like, I got time and I'm having fun. But we are not taking advantage of their time, because I think the one difference between baseball not having as much content like this versus basketball is, hey, I know basketball players are hustling during their season, but they have often multiple off days between games. Baseball barely has any off days. They still have time, but I just think you have to be approaching it differently. So that's what we do. It's almost like it's a little more than TV time, right? Like when we would bring players on when I was at MLB, it's probably more in the 10, 12-minute range, but it's not that much longer. But I think one of the scary words sometimes in baseball would be, want to come on my podcast? And they're like, damn, I'm grinding. It's July 20th. I don't have an hour and a half for you right now to pour my heart out. But 15, 20 minutes, before I hop on the field, I can do that. So that's how we came up with it.
I love that. And you mentioned the Alonso story. And I would assume when you're watching this all go down, you see Todd and Pete and Eric all talking, and you're kind of like, you say you're a fan. So you're watching this all unfold. Do you have any other stories where you're kind of like, this is such a cool conversation. I'm so glad to be a part of it.
It's like multiple times a week.
That's amazing though. I feel like that's cool.
Oh, it's awesome. And then you just kick back. That's the part where you're like, hey, can you disappear?
You set it up and then kind of let it happen.
Set it up, kick back. And also, I mean, behind the scenes, there is production staff that is making sure there's elements that are prepared. So it's handled like a digital show. That's why, I mean, I don't care. People can call it a podcast because it is a pod too, but I think it's a digital show. I mean, just like we're
I,
looking
I
at
agree.
here.
When I was waiting to go on, it felt like a show for sure.
Yeah,
For sure.
yeah, it's got it right. There's graphics, there's elements, right? There's pictures maybe from social, there's video that's mixed in. So there's a team behind it, and I'm seeing all the action behind the scenes. Can we find that clip? Can we find anything from that? Let's put that on the ticker on the bottom of the screen. And then also for our social team, they're immediately grabbing the clip and putting it out there. So other stories, I'll get back to you because I'll think about it because I want to give you some good ones, but
Totally.
it pops up all the time. And
it's a great problem to have.
It's great. It's often topics where it's something that, like, let's say you and I covering baseball for years have heard, but you haven't heard it out in the open that much. And once they start going about it, it's really good. So I would say, I mean, obviously you have your basics where it's like food in the clubhouse or someone's contract situation, stuff like that. But I don't know, there's so many parts of the sport. Also, when we see stories, this is cool, we get to ask about. So I think it was Stephanie Apstein put out the story. Yes, it was. I don't want to, because I actually spoke to her about it recently when she did the Yankees weren't paying for Wi-Fi for the players. So obviously our players are all over that, because if they didn't play for them, they're like, what? And so they, to a few of the Yankees, they're like, did they not pay for the Wi-Fi? They're like, yeah, they didn't. And then the story came out and they fixed it. You know, so stuff like that, where you're actually able to just bring stories and something that pops up in the news, like right to the players for them to talk about. Sometimes you're like, no way, that really happened. And it's like, yeah. And AJ on his own, Pierzynski, obviously you'll have to get him on here sometime. But I mean, going back to towards the beginning of the season, he talked about the Phantom IL, which came up again, because I think it still hasn't come out yet. What happened with the Mets? They're being investigated for the Phantom IL. I'm like, the Phantom IL has been around for a long time, and the players joke about it, where Pierzynski went on the Phantom IL, he said, for the Braves, and he wasn't hurt. And he's like, can we say that I'm sorry, we keep going to the same region here, but he's like, can we say I have anal fissures as my injury? And they're like, no. Just
don't they have a drop down box where they can select something? Because Dan Straley once told me, he was like, yeah, you can like select something. And sometimes they were just curious because Dan, he was a journeyman, so he was always on the IL because he had a 10-year career. And he was saying like there's a drop down box, and there was travel diarrhea was one of them. And that's like an actual thing. And Logan Webb talked about it recently when they went to Mexico, the Giants. So they have a full-on drop-down box of things that you can select, I guess.
PhantomIL.com, something like that. So those kinds
hopefully it doesn't interrupt with my new territory online, but we'll see. We'll see what happens there.
I'll look up to see if it's taken. But no, that's gold right there too. Same thing. Like it's actually against the rules of the sport, but everyone knows that it exists. So hearing players talk about it and joke about it, especially it's usually after the fact, then that's good content in my mind.
And you mentioned the cultural relevance in other sports, and that's something that's always bothered me. Like I'm in love with the sport, and I know I look at it differently, and I just don't get why people, quite frankly, don't give a shit about it. And it just drives me nuts, because I'll be taking photos of Tony Kemp's cleats, or I will be taking photos of things that like are so unique and fun and different that they're doing in NBA and in the NFL. And those things get totally talked about and, retweeted or whatever it's called now. So what are you thinking about as far as the media, baseball media, compared to other sports? Is there a competition? Or, I mean, numbers wise, we know what sports reign supreme, but how can baseball differentiate, or can they at this point?
I think there's already a playbook out there that we should just follow it. So we're trying to follow it as a media company and a media outlet. And I think for players, they can do the same thing. And the leagues can do the same thing too on a number of fronts that goes beyond even just marketing players. Just look, and I'm sure they do this, look at what other leagues have done really well and maybe some things that you don't like. And you can do the same thing. You don't always have to recreate, especially with baseball. Like, it's no secret, football is tops in the country. And then as far as content and spice and drama and players, having their own shows, I would say basketball is definitely in second place in that category right now. I don't even know if baseball is in third. I mean, you tell me. Like, I think there's more golf podcasts and
Yeah.
shows and real talk about the sport over there than there is with baseball. That was, part of the construction of this was, I mean, more shows like this can exist, whether it's a current player, and Mookie Betts has his show this year that he was doing every week or two, which was awesome for us to listen to. And we had him on to promote it.
Yeah.
We don't have any rules. And also, like, there's so little there. Nobody should be thinking about competition in our sport either, right? When you probably have, I'm not paying as close attention right now because I just don't have time, but like in the NBA, there's probably at least 15, 20 current players with their own shows or media company. I mean, there's barely any in baseball. So everybody should just be like supporting each other and vaulting it up. So it's like, oh, you have a show, right? Like we had Trevor May on recently, like, cool, man, let's talk about your pod, and then come on and like give us a taste of like what they could get every week from Trevor May's content, Yes. So I think we just have to look at the other sports and see what they're doing well. Obviously, baseball does some things really well. I think the thing that they do as well as anyone is volume of content in games. We have games every day, and we have them during a time period in the summer where there's not as much going on. That's one of baseball's best advantages, and just being able to chill often outside. Also, shout out to any ballpark that doesn't have a retractable roof that's in a bad weather area like New York, Minnesota, etc. But we have things that make our sport special. And we should look at other sports and be like, what are they doing well? That's what we did, Jess. Like we looked at, say on the football side, and I'll probably leave a billion names out, but like you look at McAfee's show and media company, you look at I Am Athlete and Pivot and all of these athlete focused content groups. We're not doing exactly what they're doing, right? But we're taking pages out of that playbook and being like, wouldn't this work in baseball? That's it. It's that simple.
Yeah. Work smarter, not harder, I always say. What would you define as a good piece of baseball content?
On the field, off the field, just general question?
I think a general question, because I feel like you would have to combine both. I feel like you can combine bits and pieces of those things.
Good piece of baseball content is, I guess, the inside story behind something big that goes down, right? So I'll bring in one of our other shows to help tell the story here. We have a weekly show called Legends Territory, and that is with former players each week. We've had some big names on and big personalities and guys that, I mean, Mark McGuire's on. Obviously, we're talking steroids. That's going to get a lot of attention.
Yeah.
Jonathan Papelbon is one of our more recent ones.
I love him.
He said a lot when he played, but
He's amazing.
Says, he what?
He's amazing. I love him.
He is a machine. I mean, however you felt about him as a player, whatever. And also some of these guys were before their time in terms of how much they spoke and showed themselves off, right? To be a showman, to not just say cookie cutter answers. And he is that guy. So we bring him on, and relevant right now. I mean, he played with Bryce. They got into it. It's not just telling that full story. It's the next layer of, hey, we went into the clubhouse, and you can hear the interview. I mean, he was taking shots at Matt Williams and how he basically just didn't even touch it or handle it at all. Those stories, right? Everyone knew the main story. I want to know every freaking juicy detail, because at the time, for the most part, it's short. It's, hey, that's the past. Now we're going to move past that. Everything good. Everyone loves each other. That, I think, is a big part of how this all came together too, is players that I have friendships with, or that are people that I've covered that are acquaintances for years that I pass and that I've spoken to, have joked about this. And I'm like, damn, that's fucked up to say I'm in autopilot when I'm doing most interviews, right? I'm like, but doesn't that suck?
Yeah.
And they're like, yeah, but we just know, say after the game, they're going to come up to me and say, what was your approach on that homer and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, that's fine. And then they just have their generic reply. Not all of them, but many have said, like, I go on autopilot on many interviews, depending on where they're coming from or what the topics are. So for me, I'm like, we need to go past that. It's 2023. Also, there's a younger audience that's used to people being more authentic and saying what they want because they've had platforms, or they can start their own show in 5 seconds. You don't have to be working for a legacy network to have a voice. So that's where it's changed.
I love that. Last two before I let you go. What's it like working with AJ Pierzynski?
Next to him almost every day. Actually sitting in his seat right now. Hi, AJ. You had a better background. So it's awesome. He's a great teammate. He is reliable, super opinionated, passionate, and cares about what we're doing. And I think also he cares about the topics that we're covering, right? This isn't just a job for him. And also, I mean, he's watching games and talking like this anyway in life. Now he gets to actually do it for the world on a daily basis versus just doing, say, his game of the week that he would do all season. So I think he has the same mindset of, say stuff, right? He was like that as a player, and he tells players that sometimes too. Like, say it, it makes you more relatable. And yes, there, especially younger players that are worried about a contract extension or something like that. Some of them are going to be a little more careful or tiptoe. And also, you don't want to throw someone under the bus that's your teammate. It's not necessarily what he's saying, but he's just like, just be yourself. It comes up across better. And that's what he does. And he'll say, like, love it or hate it. And also often doesn't give a shit what people think about his answers. And that's important. For us, we want to, like I'm saying, our whole team at Foul Territory, we want to work with people that are not incredibly concerned about every word that comes out of their mouth, like so calculated that they're worried about their next job or anything like that. Like, if I worked with them and auditioned them in a team job or at a league job, it's the kind of people that they'd be like, they're too real. We don't want them. Like that's who you want. So and most people have that in them. I think AJ does an exceptional job of bringing that out of people. And I think that he has a really clever way of stirring the pot without it feeling fake.
Yeah.
It's more like if you hear a BS answer from a player, I'm not going to say anything for the most part. He does. He'll go, bullshit, dude. That was a dumb move. I played like that's perfect. Because that's what everyone wants to say. And he has the respect of players because he had over 2,000 hits and he works his ass off and he knows what he's talking about. So I love it. He's a dude. I mean,
he is a dude for sure.
Yeah. Some Cubs fans might feel differently about him, but they just don't know. And if you came out and had a beer with AJ, then you'd probably be like, okay, my mindset has completely changed about that guy.
And what's interesting is before I ever went on the show with y'all, I had and it was before anybody told me anything about him. But when Mark Kotze is your manager and you spent a lot of time with AJ Pierzynski, and Kotz doesn't have a mean bone in his body. And he just said, he's like, Pierzynski's like a great guy and he's a great teammate to have. They burnt their bats on the foul lines because they needed a reset with their hitting. And that's Pierzynski's the guy you call to do that. That's the guy you called. Can we go put our bats on fire because I can't hit right now? That's
his stories are never ending, right? And you want that, and you want stories that are also like relatable to the current game, where he's still playing with guys that he has incredible, moments with in life, and obviously he has many relationships with players that are coming on our show that he either played with or is friendly with, like Scherzer and Wainwright, and some of these guys that are important voices in the game that want to speak like this. So I think that part's clutch too. But oh my gosh, he has never-ending stories. And when I say doesn't hold back, I mean, let's keep in mind, played for the White Sox for a while, still does, events and things for them and with them, but also just tells it like it is. Like, White Sox had a dumpster fire season. Let's not beat around the bush. It's cool. And we can get like really deep on what went down there. And that's important too. And that's good for his credibility. I think for most people, and that's the one thing we're trying to stand out with is, yeah, sure, we're bringing on tons of players, but we're just going to be real about what the situation is. We also have brought on many managers, execs, whatever, right? So you're just, as long as people just know that it's not like someone's in his ear or someone's in my ear or whatever about what we're saying, then I think the respectability is there, because obviously everyone in life has bias in some form. But this isn't just like a player focused PR spin. Like if you look up what we've done, it's, I would say, quite neutral in terms of how we're covering the game.
Totally. And what about having a guy like Ken Rosenthal, legendary reporter, as part of your squad? How's that?
Legend. Amazing. Yeah. He loves it. Also keep in mind that years back when this tech media startup called The Athletic began, I think Ken was one of the first people that was a part of that project. So you can say, oh, he's a veteran in the biz, been around forever, super respectable, all of that. But he's into the new media front as well. It's like, yeah, I'm going to join a group that is going to, charge for a subscription because I believe that the content will be that strong and we will have many, many subs. And on this front too, I think Ken wants to have conversations with these guys. I think he really enjoys it. He is a hardcore journalist. You need your sources, you're reporting on what you've got, but he's also got a great personality. And you can see in the comments often, like on his clips on YouTube, for not just his Foul Territory appearances, but he's got his own show, Fair Territory, once a week. People will be like, I can listen to Ken talk about anything for 30 minutes. He's really good, and he can do it on his own, which is a very unique skill. And I won't listen to most people just talking on their own if there's not a back and forth. And he can run it. And he's got a great production staff that's putting everything together. But it's been a dream. I worked with him for years at MLB. So to be able to reunite on that front and bring him on and do many of the things that we were doing together in the past in terms of having conversations about big topics in the game, it's the same part of what we spoke about earlier, liberating.
Yeah.
Whatever's going on, we can just go all out. And who wouldn't want to hear about that?
I agree. And I know I said I had two more. Now this is my final one.
Go for it.
What do you want to see as far as the future for Foul Territory? What would you like it to look like in the future?
I mean, for the most part, more of what we're doing, just more, right? So more prominent voices in the game, right? Former players. So here's one part that we didn't get to that I think is important. When a big player in our sport retires, why don't many of them enter the media or content space at all? That was one of the problems also that I think we looked at as a group. Why is that happening? Did they make too much money? Sure, sometimes that might be the case. Although even if that is the case, they still might want to have a voice in the game. Do they want to cover a team and fly all over the country for 100 some odd games to call? Do they want to fly to a part of the country for a studio show that they don't want to do? All of these problems can be solved. So my thing is, let's get more people involved. And we keep expanding that already. We've had more kind of former players joining us. So then whether it's just within Foul Territory or you have more shows that are focused on other teams, or just extending what we're doing. We're doing shows during the playoffs that are in the evening to be able to react to games. I think that's the kind of next steps that are easy and natural to be able to do. Is you identify people that are interesting and for the host purpose just played, and then set them up at their home, tell them that they can say whatever they want and that they don't have to travel all over the place. Although every once in a while we're doing shows at ballparks. So if they want to swing by, then great. Or at sports books, because we have our a big deal with BetMGM. But for me, that's the natural evolution. Like if you ask me just 2024, what does it look like? It's just more of what we're doing.
That's great. It's a positive. That means you're on the right track. So that's great. Yeah.
Thank you. As you can tell, I'm like super fired up. So
no, I know. I love it. It's great. This
fun.
was a fantastic conversation. Thanks for stopping by, Scott.
Of course. Thank you for having me on, and you're welcome back on FT anytime.
Great. Wonderful. That was Foul Territory, Scott Braun. Thanks to him so much for stopping by. I can't believe I get to have this platform and talk to people that not only I've been watching for years, but I look up to. And it's something that never escapes me. And I'm so thankful that he stopped by. And just to hear what he has to deal with transitioning from MLB Network to Foul Territory, and the great brand that Foul Territory has continued to show, and the great guests they get, the great hosts they have with Eric Kratz, who is just a phenomenal teammate. And for him to host has been great. AJ Pierzynski, a great teammate. I do have Mark Kotze as my manager over there with the Oakland A's, and he is a former teammate of AJ Pierzynski's. And that's the guy you call when you need to figure stuff out. Talk about a fun teammate and a guy who just lets the players open up or begs the players to open up. So it's great to see. Once again, thanks so much to Scott Braun for stopping by. And thank you guys also for stopping by short and to the point on the Comeback and Awful Announcing. Make sure you come and check out everything on our websites and check out our YouTube channel on Awful Announcing. Just go to YouTube and search Awful Announcing because we have all the good stuff. You can actually physically watch this. For those of you who just like to put it on in the background, I certainly like to do that. And always to producer Philip for being my emotional support animal and my emotional support producer and all the amazing things that he does. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you next time.
Want even more short and to the point? Follow Jessica at Kleinschmidt JD and head over to thecomeback.com and awfulannouncing.com.